Okay. Welcome everyone to the live launch event for our Whispers in the Earth Anthology Kickstarter. Thank you so much for making it tonight. It's, if you're here, you know what it's about. It's been such a great day so far. We have gone over 64% in the first 12 hours. So we're here to celebrate, basically. Thank you so much for your support and for showing up here. We have most of our contributors coming to the live event today. Some people can't because of prior commitments or travels or different time zones. But because there's so many of us, we're going to divide today's event into 3 segments. I've divided up the story sort of thematically, and we're just going to talk about world folklore today and how it's represented in our anthology. So thank you so much to the first group today. So we have with us Shannon Ives, Nadia Idle, Sam Horton, Melanie Bell, and Dan Hanks. So if you guys can just quickly introduce yourselves. Your group is going to be talking about modern folklore and how we talk about folklore today. So let's start with Nadia.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, everyone, for coming to watch this. And thanks so much, Gabriella, for this initiative. I know you've worked so hard. So yeah, my name is Nadia Idle. I am a part-time lecturer here in London. I'm also a consciousness-raising workshop facilitator. I'm also a politics podcaster, but I'm also a short story writer. And the short stories and longer stories that I write tend to take place in very mundane settings in London mostly, but with kind of like really interesting and hopefully interesting to the reader, like internal worlds. And my short story is about Egyptian gods working in a corner shop in Croydon in London.
Thanks, Nadia. Sam?
Hello. Thank you for coming. Yeah, really nice to be here. I am loads of things at the moment. So I am a visual artist, costume designer, library assistant, but increasingly more and more just an author. So I write historical fantasy at the moment. My debut novel, I'm not sure if I get the right shoulder, that one, Gorse, is coming out at the end of the year. And yeah, most of my work comes back to folklore in some way or another. Yes, so I'm writing about teddy boys at the moment, but they become vampires somehow. I don't know.
You are in Cornwall really tends to inspire it, doesn't it?
It's hard to avoid it. Yeah, absolutely.
Melanie?
Hi, my name is Melanie. I'm originally from Canada. I'm now living in Brighton in the UK. I'm a writer and editor. I have 3 books published, most recently Chasing Harmony, a young adult novel. And my story in the anthology is based on the ghost ship mythology of Prince Edward Island, Canada, where I grew up.
And I have loads of questions about that. But let's move on to Dan for now.
Well, I'm Dan. I'm calling in from the Peak District in England. I'm the author of these 2 books and one coming out in January next year. And I am mainly an editor of fiction at the moment, which is a lot of fun.
Thank you, Dan. And Shannon?
My name is Shannon Ives. I'm a dark historical fantasy and horror writer living in Vermont in the deep, dark woods. And my debut novel is coming out next January. Yeah, my short story in this is kind of an exploration of what happens when people leave their folklores behind.
Yeah, it's brilliant because it really looks to the kind of dangers of forgetting folklore as well. And that takes us to, so these 5 stories are really putting a modern twist on the old, and they, out of our anthology, have possibly some of the most contemporary feel to them. So I was hoping that we could discuss what lessons can be drawn from the old stories in our modern life. And maybe we can start with Sam. Your story is putting a very mythical spin on the AI, which is a hot topic at the moment.
Yes. Yeah. So my story is based on Estonian folklore. I was really interested a couple of years ago to discover that Estonia have named their AI program Krat AI. after a folkloric creature from Estonian tradition. And I think it's really fascinating that they've chosen to give a new technology the sort of the power of some old stories. I think, folklore has always been a way that we've kind of remembered things, how we do things, about people we don't want to forget, but also it's often a warning. These stories have warnings in them. They're telling us how to be, where not to go, giving us a reason not to go into the woods. So when I heard about the Krataya, I thought, has somebody deliberately named it to make sure we're learning some lessons? In the traditional Krat stories, they're warnings against idleness, taking shortcuts, and being greedy. And it never ends very well for whoever it is that summoned the creature. And all those things could be applied in some way or other to using AI. And I don't know if it was Estonia's hope that we would have these warnings put in place when we're using it or not. But either way, I think it's fascinating that they've kind of meshed those two things together.
It's incredible. I really loved that in your story, and the fact that it's a real thing that people have called their official AI, like they named it after an evil creature. It's just it kind of fits perfectly in a kind of wider context of people maybe forgetting losing sight of what's important, and that kind of leads me to Shannon and Shannon's story, because I feel like, your story really encapsulates the dangers of what happens when we forget the stories entirely.
Yes, absolutely. So mine kind of explores the sense of disconnect and loneliness that can come from a single person losing access to their cultural stories. But like Sam said, on a more macro level, like these are often vehicles for knowledge sharing, and they impart like moral lessons and highlight local knowledge, which is obviously like very tragic to lose. But I think a greater threat is that humans are social animals, and communal stories and histories are like what bind us together, and they often give us an identity. So even if we decide to toss them aside or leave them behind, it doesn't really mean that the need we have for those goes away. And like that's a fact that like gets exploited, right? Like it's not a coincidence that fascism flourishes in places where people don't have an answer to the question of who they are. And like, interestingly enough, that often appropriates older myths along the way. Like, we have white supremacists co-opting Norse imagery as well. So I think I'm the only American on the call right now. And where I'm from the Midwest, which is like all industrialized farmland, which is where my story takes place. So what happened where I grew up is, we had white settlers displacing indigenous groups violently and systemically, never engaged with the folklore from them, which means like we couldn't have a reciprocal relationship where we learned lessons from their myth and folklore, which would have been like, there are a lot that would have been incredibly beneficial for us to hear. And now we kind of have this whole group of people, and like white Americans specifically, that don't have deep connections to the people around them or like the land. And best case scenario, we kind of have this question of like, okay, well, what rises to fill that identity, and what can people align themselves with? And it's like, I guess a healthy sense of patriotism is like the best case scenario, but like how easily that's corrupted, and we've kind of all seen that happen. So
it's interesting because it kind of ties in with what Sam said about like, you have those, when you have those old stories and you kind of forget the real lesson behind them, and you just kind of use maybe the surface level of the story. Whereas with your short story, like I really love this kind of concept of there's this sense of magic, sense of wonder out there, but when people sort of systematically eradicate it, and then you have this like beautiful sort of metaphor. I don't want to spoil the story, so it's like, but there's like a wider metaphor as well of exploiting the earth and like just leaving nothing behind. So this sense of emptiness is just really very powerful in your story. I loved it.
Thank you.
And it's, when we're talking about kind of maybe new political entities and how people sort of satisfy that need for stories in their lives and for magic, that kind of leads me to Melanie's story. So, you're from Canada, which again is a relatively new political entity. And where did those ghost ship stories come from? Like, how big was it in the kind of local folklore of where you grew up?
It was quite prominent. There are a lot of ghost stories on Prince Edward Island and in the Atlantic provinces. This one dates back as far as 1786. It's around the Northumberland Strait area. People started seeing apparitions of flaming ghost ships out on the water. And a lot of them were on Prince Edward Island. There were some in Nova Scotia. There were some in New Brunswick, the other surrounding provinces. One of my teachers claimed a sighting of this flaming ball of a ghost ship, and everyone knew someone who'd seen something.
Yeah. So it still exists, like in the kind of as a story in your community, and but it's interesting because it's not linked to anything like ancient. It's more sort of recent folklore, and because when we talk about folklore, we tend to think about something, very, very old, but it's a living entity. And I think the stories in the anthology really beautifully illustrate it. It's a living entity that grows and melts together with other things and expands as well. And I was thinking about, moving on to Nadia's short story about ancient Egyptian gods in Croydon. I thought this juxtaposition, and you do it so well. You always put this you work with contrast so well, and this juxtaposition of the ancient with this kind of it's almost like you have this almost like moment of like this is like ludicrous concept, and it works so well because like the ancient stories do sort of exist, and even when we don't explicitly know where certain folkloric elements come from, they still form a part of our community's values and how we live. And I was wondering, what elements of ancient Egypt still exist in the modern day Egypt, in the Egypt that you know?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Gabriella. Those are really kind words. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me is like thinking about what would the ancient Egyptian gods do if you put them in a completely different setting, right? And so to answer your question about like what elements from ancient Egypt like exist today, I'm really interested in time and space and how like human beings like travel over that. And of course, folklore is a huge part of that, right? So I think what I'm trying to say through a lot of my stories is you have all of this richness of the stories that are told and the people that we are and the things that we miss and the things that we dream of and we smell and we long for. And that experience is an experience that even the gods would have if they were in diaspora. So those are the kind of themes that I'm carrying through, which is that what is it, like what are some of like the essences of Egypt, which are experienced like in today's world, but also in the past's world. And then what happens how do those people think about those things if you move them across time and space? And I think the themes of what I'm trying to say there are, and that's something like, part of my experience, like I'm half English, I've lived in the UK for 22 years, I was born here, but I grew up in Egypt, my family's in Egypt. And part of me is not here. Right. There's part of me that is never here. There's always a part of me that is somewhere else. And I thought it would be interesting to tell those stories, like speaking to your point about like what are some of those aspects of the Egyptian experience that we long for and we think about when we are, you know, having to travel across space, in my case, but across time and space if you're an ancient Egyptian god. So I don't want to give away the story, of course, but, you know, there are things like the things that one of my protagonists longs for is, you know, a certain kind of lager, you know, because you cannot get beer the ancient Egyptian way like in London today. So like, what does she make do to like get that taste, to pull on that taste? And those are the things that I think are part of, you know, the human experience when we travel over space. It's the things that we taste, it's the conversations we have, where even if we're, you know, really comfortable in the spaces that we find ourselves in, there's always something where you're like, I wish I could have it, you know, the old way, or like from where I come from. And that's like a universal experience of, you know, the diaspora today, no matter how, you know, well adjusted we are in our new homes.
Absolutely. I think this is also like such a huge theme in a lot of the stories, because we have like Greco-Jamaican story, we have like, you know, like, you know, ancient sort of like Roman Nigerian, you know, story. And it's really interesting how those stories travel with people and the new context that, you know, we provide to our traditions when we move, and how they, you know, melt together. And obviously there's like, you know, like in Shannon's story, you have the danger of what happens when we resist that, when we, instead of, you know, embracing and, you know, joining traditions together, when we kind of just push it away. And I love, like, the kind of is like, I feel like there's a lot of optimism in your story. There's like a sense of longing perhaps as well. And I think people in diasporas, you know, like do experience that to an extent, even if they're perfectly happy where they are. It's like a sense of duality.
Yeah.
Before we move on to Dan's story, I just wanted to say, if you guys have any questions, just pop them in the comments. Like, we have to be quite like prompt to make sure that we don't overrun too much. But if you have any questions for our current group, just make sure to put it in the comments. And I just wanted to now move on to Dan. And the reason Dan goes last but not least is because of how your story is really unusual in a way that it melts the many different influences together. So it's in a way that is, in this story, I felt was opposite to Shannon's, in that instead of emptiness, of stories forgotten, you have like a melting pot of inspirations. So can you tell us a tiny bit of your story without giving too much away, and where that idea came from?
Well, normally I don't like to come at the end of some very smart and articulate answers, but you all helped me just figure out what my story is about. So thank you.
You're too modest as usual.
No.
That's your English side
but
coming through.
In this case, I think, you know, I'm a person of many different cultures, and I studied archaeology and lots of different things going on in the past, and we're all a collection of very different stories which make up very different personalities. So my story was looking to explore that, but in a way that it sort of explores the idea of folklore as a comfort and a sense of hope. So, you know, Shannon was talking about these things being stripped away and feeling emptiness, and, you know, evil can creep into that. And I was, unusually for me, being a bit more positive with it, and just focusing on the idea that these traditions can give us, you know, a sense of our place in the world. And, you know, with every generation, the world changes, and we have to sort of reevaluate where we sit in those places, which is where I think we need to draw from all these different sources and update them, you know, with each passing generation.
Yeah, I think it's a really important, like, hope is such an important point, because, like, you know, like in Sam's story, I felt like, you know, this kind of like the message forgotten. It's like there's like a poignancy there as well. Like, if the story itself is not like sad, it's actually quite humorous at points. Like I really enjoyed that humor element, Sam. And but I felt that there's this sense that like, oh, do we not know what we're about anymore? And in your story, Dan, I felt like it's just moving forward, and it's about like what's next. And I think like the big metaphor in your story is just this like what's next for us. And I just thought it was a beautiful message.
Yeah, well, the world is a trash fire, so I'm trying to be positive. And how do we get better from here?
You're like the Ghibli creator who creates those beautiful, like, atmospheric, happy images, happy movies. And then, when people interview him, he's like, life is suffering.
That's the best compliment I've had in a long time. Thank you.
Well, creating something as gorgeous as Ghibli movies is a compliment indeed. So thank you guys so much. And yes, moving forward, like, Dan's story tells us to, we're going to jump to the next segment. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. So for those watching, our contributor, Stephen Arian, is doing the amazing work of actually putting everybody on and taking them off when necessary.
I'm here, but I'm not really. I'll be back later.
Here, but not really. This is a smaller group because Caroline Hardacre had to cancel at the last moment, I'm afraid, but she's with us in spirit. So for our next segment, we'll be talking about bodies in folklore, and sort of our three stories really focus on that element. Like, when talking about what folklore is, just to give a quick introduction to it, like, my personal definition of folklore always leads to comparing it to what mythology is. In that mythology is about like, gods and creatures beyond our ken, like with powers that put them so far above us, while folklore always stays close to the people. And therefore the themes of bodies and all their reality, their earthiness, are such an intrinsic element of it. And especially the stories that we describe in this segment. So I hope you welcome Helen Harradine and Sarah Daly.
Hello.
So if you guys can introduce yourselves a little, start with Helen, maybe.
Yeah, hello. Oh, I'm so excited. Yeah, it's so cool to hear about the other stories. I'm so excited to read them all. But my name's Helen Harradine. I write short stories as well as longer form prose novels. I'm based in the beautiful Scottish borders, and I'm deeply inspired by Scotland and its stories and its beasties and its mythologies and legends. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. I've got various other hats as well. I've been with three little people all day, and my malevolent little people all day, which is my three children. And my story, An Orcadian Birth, is about a malevolent little person called a trow, which you will find trows in Orkney and Shetland. They're only based there. And they are very, very bad, naughty people. And my story is about a malevolent little person kidnapping a pregnant person. So.
Yes, which is a beautiful story to write when you were pregnant with your third child, I felt.
Indeed.
I really like that. I really connected with that element of it. Sarah, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I live in Chicago, or right outside Chicago, Illinois, so I'm in the States. My debut novel, Obsidian, from Angry Robot Books, was out in January 2022. I have a second book coming out with Angry Robot. It hasn't been officially announced yet. In August, it keeps moving. I think it's August 2025. So I write fantasy mainly, but I don't really, my books kind of bounce all over the place, whatever catches my fancy at the time. I usually have very strong female characters in there somewhere who like to kick butt and take names. But this story I wrote for the anthology Feeding Monsters is more about the horrors of war and the destruction that man can wreak on other men, and having it awaken like a primordial creature from the earth who is basically responding to the horrors of above, like it's disturbed by it, you know. And I suppose it is pretty body horror centric because it takes place in Stalingrad, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with Battle of Stalingrad, but it was a pretty terrible time, and a lot of starvation and freezing and just bad things happening all around. So, and I threw a dragon in there.
I mean, even in Poland, where we tend to talk almost obsessively about the horrors of World War II, Stalingrad is kind of just whispered about, really. And,
right.
And I felt that you made it justice in this kind of folkloric way. You really brought some of those elements in beautifully. Because I'm on this segment as well, I'll be introducing myself. I'll be interviewing myself and introducing myself. One woman band. So I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm a Polish author living in the UK, and I'm the author of 4 Slavic folklore inspired novels, The Second Bell and The Bone Roots, that came out from Angry Robot Books, and the children's duology, The Wind Child and The Storm Child, that are out from Euclid. And I do enjoy a bit of body horror, especially in my latest book. And my story is all about that. So, yes, I kind of, when it comes to, so my story is called Kozytka. And Kozytka in Slavic folklore is an old rusałka, basically. So for those who are not familiar with Slavic folklore, rusałka is the spirit of a beautiful drowned woman. They're always beautiful, isn't it? Who lures men to their death by just minding her own business on the edge of a lake. And Kozytka is a rusałka that has lived long enough to lose all her charms, but she still dreams of luring men to their watery grave. And I just find that, you know, old stories might, you know, it's set in the modern day, but it's from her point of view, because I find like that the old stories might sometimes lose their appeal. I think it's a cyclical thing. But even if they do, they never quite lose their power because they're about such fundamental topics. And speaking of fundamental topics and something quite universal to the human race, Helen, you know, in your story, you know, childbirth is such an unwaveringly powerful theme. It's, you know, and so it's so important to folklore as well.
Absolutely.
And, you know, the story you described, like the horror you described, and the loss of control associated both with the act of childbearing and the myths of changeling just seems to marry together. So can you talk a little bit about your story and what's behind it?
Yeah, so the trowels in Orkney and Shetland, well, I hadn't heard about them until relatively recently. My friend Francisca, who's a local oral storyteller, told me about them, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to write a story from a point of view of a really bad little person based in Orkney? Now, trowels, they can't have their own children, so they steal unsuspecting pregnant people's children and swap them out for a changeling because their children are born very sickly. And I feel like there's a primal fear around pregnancy, birth, and there have been all these stories around changelings, around this topic, because of this fear, and because when something does go wrong, then these are the answers that folklore provides. You know, this is what has gone wrong, because this trow has taken this baby. And it's so interesting because I feel like there's still an aura of magic around pregnancy and childbirth. And there is still an element of fear because there is that loss of control when you're in labor.
And because it's always like a life-threatening procedure, no matter the conditions into which, you know, you're born, it's still there is still an element of risk, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the kind of surreal magic of a body making another body. And ultimately my story is what greater fear is there than a mother losing her child, or to have a child taken away.
Although I feel like in your story, like the sense of responsibility that folklore sometimes places on the victim is almost unfair, in the sense of, like, you know, this bad thing happened to you because you did not follow the rules. Absolutely.
And not to give too much away, but kind of at the end there's a kind of mirror image of her. So you know, there's her natural kind of opening, and she makes an unnatural opening in her kidnapper. Spoiler alert.
Yes, we don't want to spoil it too much. But yes, I thought that duality was really, really good. And I mean, when it comes to sort of folkloric attitudes to children, that is really contrasted very sharply, Sarah, in how characters in your story treat children. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, like I said, my inspiration, the setting is Stalingrad. And one of the things I learned about the Battle of Stalingrad is how many children were orphaned and basically living in the city during all this horrific combat, all the struggles and starvation and freezing temperatures. And the soldiers basically used them as like messengers and whatever was useful. And somehow they survived, and a lot of these children survived after the war, or after the battle was done. And it just astounded me that children could manage to survive through this when so many grown men with weapons, you know, died horribly. So I wanted to have them be a central part of the story, have the children survivors, and kind of give an idea of how maybe they might have survived, in the idea that there's something primeval or primordial that's down in the earth, that the bombs and the war woke up essentially, and becomes almost like a protector for the children, and it provides, you know, it's essentially, you know, it's a dragon myth at its heart. Because every culture, basically, it seems like every culture has its own dragon myth, and the Russians are no different. And I made it a female dragon just because of a mother figure, you know, and you can take that in many ways, you know, and it's a multi-headed beast. But I lost my train of thought. But I wanted it to be not on, you know, it's dangerous to everything else there except the children, and it keeps them warm and fed and protected, while everyone else around them, all the adults around them who have caused all this destruction, are suffering horribly, and it goes badly for the soldiers when they do come across this creature down below by being cruel to the children.
Absolutely. I thought that in terms of, you know, when we're on the subject of body horror, the very, you know, animalistic, you know, horror of extreme hunger, and the desensitization to suffering of others, and this ability of people to switch off their compassion for other people's children, you know, like these are, you know, you said at the very beginning of your story, I think you didn't actually like see them as children. and that sense of separation of, you know, oneself from the other. I thought you did very powerfully, and it's really interesting because, you know, in Sarah's story, we have children who are, you know, discarded almost, and they're treated as pests and used instrumentally. And then in Helen's story, you have, you know, children as this extremely precious resource, which is, you know, children are extremely precious. And there's this sense of, you know, when you have something that is so precious, it can be taken from you if you don't look after it, if you don't, you know, follow the rules. And of course, you know, in that sense, you have the soldiers in Sarah's story who don't follow the rules.
Like they've devolved essentially to where they're all about just feeding themselves. Like, what can I do to feed myself? That's all they care about. They're reduced to just their own hunger and their own suffering is the only thing that, it's like their entire world becomes about just suffering, and nothing else beyond it really matters. Like, they don't, you know, they're supposedly fighting for their homeland, or, you know, fighting for a cause or whatever. But at this point, at this point in Stalingrad, when it gets to this point, no one really cares anymore about winning, because it's basically they're not even, you basically you've lost your humanity at this point.
Yes, and that loss of humanity also comes at its own cost, doesn't it?
Right.
So thank you, guys. I think to make it fair, because there's only 3 of us,
right.
We will cede our remaining 3 minutes of our segment very generously to the next group. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriella.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, and now Stephen is doing his magic. Okay, amazing. So thank you guys so much for coming. So our third and last group of contributors for today, we'll be talking about old stories seen through modern lens. And we are missing one person. We're missing Rachel. Is Rachel on the screen? Let's give her a little minute. I don't know where she is. She is supposed to be here, but okay. If Stephen can just keep an eye just in case she's running late. Rachel has, in her defense, 4 children, and that is a lot to be dealing with between deadlines and all that. So we're going to be talking about, like I said, old stories from modern lens. So we have with us tonight Stephen Arian, Tracy Fahey, Sophia Baghdadi, and Matthew C. Brown, sorry. Always forget the middle initials. So
no worries.
Thank you so much for coming. So if you guys can briefly introduce yourselves for those who are not yet familiar with your work. So shall we start with Stephen?
Hi, I'm Stephen Arian. I write epic fantasy, and my current series is historical fantasy set in 13th century Persia. But the story in this will come on to something completely different. It goes back to my kind of where I grew up in the northeast of England.
Okay, brilliant. And Matthew?
I'm Matt, or Matthew, whatever. I'm a science fiction fantasy writer, just writing under the broad umbrella of science fiction fantasy. I currently have a fantasy novel out on submission to editors.
Okay, so if editors are listening to this, you know what to do. Tracy?
Hi, I'm Tracy Fahey. I write mostly about folklore and the Gothic and the weird intersection between the two. I'm currently working on my 7th book, which is a collection of short stories to do with the Irish Hag. And I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me, Gabby.
Thank you so much for coming. And Tracy is also like a real folklorist, like academic level folklorist. So I'm sure she's going to give us a lot of very interesting insights today. And Sophia.
Hi. So I'm relatively new to the publishing process, but not so much to the writing game. I think like many of us, I'm speaking for all of you now, my writing started out with really bad teenage angsty poetry, but luckily for everyone, it's developed a lot since then. So I write fantasy books, principally about stories.
Oh, hold on. There was a bit of an echo there. Sorry, can you
try again?
Can you try again? Yes.
Yeah, so I write fantasy stories about people who don't fit in and people who feel like the world wasn't made for them. Probably the main link in my stories.
Yes, and it's so these. We got loads of comments about like Stephen doesn't need to introduce himself. It's like, excuse me, the same for everybody.
It's fine. It's fine. We're a collective here today.
So the stories in this segment are the ones that sort of keep the most to what we associate with traditional storytelling. Hello, Rachel. So happy to have you on.
Good to see you.
So these stories are the ones that we associate the most with traditional storytelling patterns, yet each of these retellings sort of has a modern undertone to it, or like a little twist that the readers will hopefully be able to recognize. So Rachel, seeing as you just came on, can you introduce yourself very, very briefly, and we'll move on with our questions.
Sure. Hey, I'm Rachel Chimasi-Corson. So I typically write fantasy that's based in West Africa. And for this anthology, I've written a story called Anansi's Daughter.
Yes. So, Rachel, like sort of starting with your story then, like people might have heard of Anansi. Maybe they've, if they're not too much into folklore, they might have seen it on the American Gods TV show, the trickster, sort of spider god. But you offer us his daughter's point of view. So what new perspective do you think that brings to the Anansi stories?
Sure. So thinking of Anansi, you always think of him being, based out in Ghana with all the animals on the savannah at some distant point in the past, right? And when I was writing this story, I was thinking a lot about this whole eldest immigrant daughter concept and how, I'm the eldest African daughter in my family, and how you end up kind of carrying a lot. And I started thinking about whether this was a new concept or whether this has been around for a while, this idea of like the eldest daughter in the family carrying a lot of the emotional labor. And, in a lot of societies, the oldest boy will carry like the family name and the family line. And the oldest girl carries all of the responsibility.
The labor, yeah.
All of the labor and the difficult part of it, not so much the fun of the responsibility, not so much the positive sides, more the difficulties and the stresses. And back in the time when I presume Anansi was set, the original stories, it probably wasn't like that. A lot of the societies are matrilineal, but I am a child of the diaspora. I grew up in London, where it very much is that way. And I guess these ideas just kind of melded together in my mind. But I thought that if Anansi was to, choose whether he wants to roll with the matriarchal ways of his society or try and be a patriarch, I think he would attempt to be a patriarch. And that would lead to the kind of relationship with his daughters that you see in my story. So that's where the idea kind of came from. It was lots of what-ifing in my mind.
Yes, what I really like about the story is that you preserve a lot of the kind of storytelling patterns and the rhythm of your writing. It feels very much like oral storytelling. It does preserve that sense of tradition, but it brings a very new perspective, and this concept of the forgotten voices being given the center stage all of a sudden is something that people are talking about a lot now. And that kind of leads me to Tracy's story, because your story, you know, All the Drowned Women, it's almost like an overview of the many, many stories of women drowning, of women disappearing. And in that sense, it touches on the subject of generational trauma in a way that feels very fresh, and it feels very true to the stories. And yet it still feels like a modern perspective. Like, why is this theme important to you?
Well, I guess that folklore to me is never something that's dead. I'm a huge fan of Alan Dundas, the psychoanalytic folklorist, who talks about how folklore is a living entity. And it's something that I truly believe. These old stories survive for a reason. And this particular story was one that I'd been drawn to. And when I saw your beautiful lino cut, Gabby, of the woman underwater, it's actually a Rusalka, I think, wasn't she? I asked you straight away if I could choose that one to write to. But yeah, this story. So I mentioned I've been working on a collection of stories to do with the hag, the Irish hag, or the Cailleach. So the Cailleach has a daughter, Cliona, who's drowned by her father, the hag's lover, Manannán mac Lir. And the weirdest thing happens, though, in the story. Irish folktales are wonderful. They're always taking these twists and turns. So Cliona doesn't drown. She's reborn as a banshee and the queen of the South Munster fairies. And this is where the story starts to get very weird, because in the medieval period, she... Yeah?
Just stops to get weird.
Oh, yeah, no. This is where it starts to get weird for me, personally. So she has a child, according to a medieval manuscript that was found in the 1800s. She's a child by a mortal man, and this child is called Conor Cliona. In the early 20th century, the politician Michael Collins claimed kinship with Conor Cliona through the O'Leary sept. Everybody following so far? Anyway, my grandmother was a descendant of Michael Collins. So it goes the hag, Cliona, Conor Cliona, Michael Collins, my grandmother, my mother, and me. So this was a story that I think I've been unconsciously working towards for about 2 years in all the deep research that I've been doing in folklore. And this, because I've been writing stories to the theme of healing, and particularly to the healing of women. And in this one, it's really about cleansing back down the ancestral line and kind of redressing old wrongs and revoicing, I suppose, in a positive way.
Yes, I definitely feel like it has that, and it does have that sense of sort of melancholy to it, but with it has a sense of hope in it as well, which, you know, and I thought it was very powerful, and she sort of doesn't take away from the sort of seriousness of, like, you know, we're talking generational trauma and like the disappearing women. And I found the theme that you mentioned of the woman who, you know, she doesn't die, but she becomes a banshee. So she is given back her voice, but in a very particular way, very limited sort of capacity, isn't it? And
yes, yeah. And it's also about women's history as well, because the hag herself appears in the story disguised as the contemporary older woman Callie, and she rescues a girl called Maris from the sea who's lost her voice, and she tells her stories. So many of my stories are kind of modelled in Irish folktales, in which people inside the stories are always telling stories. But I was particularly drawn to the notion of female storytellers, and the idea that women's history is fundamentally quite an oral history, because women were omitted from a lot of kind of official canon records. So at one stage, Callie says to Maris that women's stories are written on water. And that was the kind of theme that I wanted to return to.
I think it's beautiful, and it really goes with Rachel's story, I think, as well, in the sense that you have a woman that, you know, is very much there, and yet she is unseen, and she is in the background, and she's doing, you know, the labor in the background, and you have the people who do take the you know, stage ahead of her, and who do, you know, take all the glory, but she is still there, and you know, she's not unimportant. And I really love that sort of sense of giving voice to people, and that actually ties in beautifully, I think, with Sophia's story. So Sophia, can you your story felt instantly familiar, even though I'm not familiar with Persian myths and folklore, which is, I think, a testament to how stories actually travel. And it feels old, but it has some feminist undertones on the theme of, you know, voice and carving out your own destiny. Like, what do you think is so appealing about retelling the Genesis myth?
Well, I think already on this live stream, we've talked a lot about the purpose of stories, and there's been, you know, to form identities, to give warnings. But I think if you go back to some of the older stories, they answer questions. And, you know, I guess originally those questions were stuff like, why do we have seasons? Why is there a mountain over there? Why are my cows dying? But then it gets eventually more sophisticated to, where do we come from and why are we here? And I think, my headphones are not playing ball. And I think that is what is so amazing about the Genesis story, is we still don't have an answer to that question. There is no strict scientific answer to where we came from and why we're here.
Yes, and I think it's, you know, it's not just that, but it's what you specifically bring in is the origins of not just our sort of physicality of, you know, how humans came to be, but how is our spirit the way it is, and what else could be out there. Like,
yeah,
can you expand on that? Like, you know, the character in your story.
For sure. So I guess for people who aren't familiar with things, it's almost a reimagining of the Garden of Eden with Persian mythology and Zoroastrian myth, which is the pre-Islamic Persian religion. And there's a character which is very similar to Lilith. And there's a reason why she's very similar to Lilith. And that's because Persia and the First Empire took over Babylon, and Lilith is a Babylonian demon character. And for me, whenever I see that there is a female character who's a demon, I always want to know the origin story, because I think it's so often we have stories and it was all the mother's fault, you know. And I think it's a tired archetype, and I think it's always interesting to try and find out people who do terrible things, people who could maybe become demons. Where did that come from? How did that happen? Because I don't like the idea that something is born evil.
Yeah, I feel like there's a sense of this unfulfilled potential in there as well, in a way that, you know, for example, Rachel's story, it kind of brings us to the, you know, you have the hope of fulfillment of potential, and the kind of different avenues that people can take as well. So
yeah, for sure. I think that was me feeling a bit frustrated at humankind, to be honest. That was what came out there. I think that there's so much more we could do, so much more we could be if we worked together more. And I think I was using the story as a mechanism to express that frustration.
Yeah, I definitely got that from the story, and I'm sure that the readers will too. I think it asks more questions than it answers in some ways, and I think that the best stories tend to do that. So staying back on the kind of the very old stories, we move on to Stephen. So when I told one of our contributors who isn't there, who's a novener, about your story, she got so excited. She sent me a voice note, like singing like a little ditty from the north about that particular element of folklore.
Mhm.
So, can you tell us a little bit about it and what drew you to this particular one?
So the folklore that I'm kind of redoing my version of is a story called the Lambton Worm, which is basically it's a dragon myth from the northeast of England where I grew up. That's very, very particular to the area, and I grew up on fantasy. So the fact that it had knights in and a dragon was always going to win my attention and always get me involved with it. And when I was in primary school, we did a kind of reenactment of it. And thankfully, I'm old enough that there's no actually physical proof apart from analog photos. So there's no evidence online of me dressed up as a knight fighting a pretend dragon.
I'm
But
really disappointed now. I would put it on the
my mum's got
Kickstarter
one somewhere in a
page
cupboard,
as
but you'll never
on the
find
reel.
it, and no one's ever going to scan that in and put it online. Anyway, so I was growing up in fantasy and all these kind of stories, and there is a kind of oral tradition of this story that people have been telling for decades. But it was only when I was probably in my 30s I went back and revisited it and realized what the story was actually about. Without spoiling it, it's around the time of one of the Crusades this story takes place. And it deals with a lot more issues to do with trauma and to do with sin, possibly, and Christianity and the things you carry with you and the things you leave at home, the things you can't get rid of. And so it's on the surface, it's a very kind of basic story, which is why I was attracted to it as a child, George and the dragon and slaying the evil monster and that kind of thing. But it's when you come back and revisit it as an adult, you go, yeah, that's all fun, that's great. But there's a lot more actually there that reading it as an adult and knowing what I know now, I'm more drawn to it. And it's just been sat in the back of my brain for like 40 years at this point.
Yeah, I think it's in a kind of on a theme of like what Tracy was also talking about like people carrying that with certain things with them. And I thought that the Crusades element is really interesting because it's something that is like, very ancient. And then you have something that, feels still relevant today in the way that we conduct ourselves in a kind of wider political world.
Yeah. There's a lot of turmoil even now, as you see in the news all the time, the turmoil out there. So there's echoes right through to the present, how we conduct ourselves in the present and how we did in the past in that area in particular. So yeah, there's a lot going on beyond a man in a pointy hat fighting a dragon.
Absolutely. And speaking of kind of moving on to kind of modern things, like Matthew, like your story really highlights, I think, the core theme in our anthology of how stories can travel and melt into one, and how do we rediscover the old story's true origins.
I'm pleased to hear you say that, considering I had no idea what I was doing while I was writing this story. I guess I felt like, when you first asked me to join, I was like, folklore, like that's not really my wheelhouse, but I'll give it a shot.
And you did it really well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But when thinking about the true origins of some of these stories, I mean, I was like, that is a really good question. Like, how do you do that? I'd love to know. But there's a lot of these stories that we know. I got to thinking about how these stories. There's a lot of stories all across the world that you'll see similarities across cultures, and sometimes it's just because of people that were living in proximity to each other, or sometimes it's just because I think humans have a shared imagination of the things they want to explore and like the thoughts and feelings they want to explore. And so you can see a lot of different shades of themes in different stories, but finding the root of it all can be kind of tricky, particularly in the situation regarding my stories, because colonialism is involved. And naturally, one of the many ill side effects of colonialism is just the erasure of culture and stories. That is definitely something that we don't know how many stories we've lost because of stuff like that.
I mean, there's definitely, they still survive. And it's interesting because in an earlier segment, when we were talking with Shannon Ives about her story, which highlights the dangers of emptying the earth of its old stories and its old kind of wisdoms. And in your stories, there's almost like there's this sense of, not to give too much away, there's a sense of rediscovery of,
Yes.
that those stories are not gone. They have been, sometimes incorporated. They've been like taken into the sort of umbrella of the new. And sometimes we still get access to, what was there before.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this because with a lot of different stories across culture, from folklore to mythology, you'll see some things in there when it's not just the straight and narrow, white Eurocentric point of view. You'll find footnotes in there from all over the world. And in the case of my story about the Jersey Devil, the origins of it were kind of just a footnote. Like even when I was trying to do research for it, I was very hard to go and find anything, any little nuggets, any morsels that could kind of expand on what the origins were for this particular tale. And I think a lot of it has to do with finding those footnotes and trying to expand on them as much as we can, because then that's the only way we're going to be able to extract any new information about where these stories came from.
And I mean, in this group, Tracy is your woman for looking at footnotes and rediscovering the ancient, signs of ancient stories, I think. And it's really interesting. I think the job of someone who is writing, stories written in folklore. We have like Rachel's story, where you take what could have been there and you create something new out of what was there, but out of what might have been and what we have not sort of given our consideration. And then you have Sophia's story, which gives us like a different perspective on something that's already there. So the characters are already there in Sophia's story, but she gives them voice in a brand new way. And I think there's all those different things in between that can happen as well, and that space in between. And the stories in the anthology really sort of approach it in a different way. And I think that's why it's such a special collection. And we have so many special contributors. You haven't seen them all today, sadly, but every story brings something new and a new perspective to the old. So on that note, I would like to thank you all. I'd like to thank our contributors who have made the time to taken the time to be here today and who have created something really special. So
thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you.
Gabby.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, everyone, tuning in tonight.
All right, thanks everyone. We're going to end the stream here, but don't forget to check out the Kickstarter. There's a link down below. Google it, promote it on social media. That
yes,
would be great.
help us, please. Help us out to get the word out there. So we're getting there, and it's gone really nicely. And I just hope that people find out about it and that we can spread the word. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to end the stream there, everyone. Good night.
Bye.